Hello, everyone. This is the 233rd episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back English author Mr. Robert Fielder as we discuss the 1992 UEFA European Championships. Mr. Fielder is the author of The Complete History of the World Cup and A Complete History of the European Championship. Welcome back, Robert.
Thank you very much. Great to be back.
So last time we left off with the 1988 Euros. So this time we dive into the 1992 Euros. This were to be the fourth to be hosted like a proper tournament. How was the status and the importance of the tournament compared to the forgettable 1980 edition, as well as the very successful 1984 and 1988 editions?
Yeah, so I think football in this stage is increasingly international in its outlook. I think you've got more players who are playing abroad, and there's just a greater sort of awareness of the international game as opposed to the domestic game. So I think at this point as well, as you say, the last two Euros have been really, really successful. There was a sort of visibility of the Euros as being very much second place now to the World Cup in terms of status and importance, but a worthy number two. I think if we look in the 1970s, for example, and maybe at the start of the 1980s, the Euros yet hadn't quite established themselves as being quite so prestigious as the World Cup was, and certainly smaller in scale, smaller in spectacle, smaller in terms of international attention to it. I think the Euros at this stage felt like a big deal. There was a lot of excitement ahead of these Euros, a lot of great players going into it. I think there was real sort of excitement that this was going to really follow in the footsteps of 1984 and 1988 in terms of quality and performances.
And as you said, the Euros were firmly established just behind the World Cup in terms of quality and importance. Now, the novelty of these 1992 Euros was that it was taking place in Sweden, where the stadiums were much smaller. Was that ever a worry?
I think we place it in the context of the time. I think this was a time when fewer fans did travel internationally. It was, the world was slightly less global and less international in terms of nature. Italia 90 and at various World Cups prior to this point, there'd been empty seats in the stands for games. So I don't think it was seen as being quite such a problem. I mean, Sweden embraced it that, the logo or the strap line for this tournament was small is beautiful. So they were really actively leaning into their position as a slightly smaller and more intimate tournament. They'd obviously hosted the World Cup in 1958 very successfully. We can see football on this pathway at this point to sort of global expansion, and this is the last time, effectively, when a country as small as Sweden is able to solo host a tournament as big as the Euros as we get into this sort of expansion that follows. So I don't think it was seen as being a problem. There was an awareness of the hooliganism that had plagued football in the 1980s that was considered to be slightly less of a concern now, but that could potentially rear its head in a smaller setting. So I think there was, as I say, excitement, a little bit of caution, but I don't think it was seen as being a sort of overwhelming factor in terms of placing the tournament in Sweden.
For the first time during the qualifiers, we had two new nations, Faroe Islands and San Marino. Why had it taken so long for nations like that to participate?
I mean, on a strictly sort of logistical basis, they hadn't been members of FIFA and UEFA previously, and therefore they hadn't been eligible to qualify. They joined, I think, very tail end of the 1980s at the start of 1990, around then, both of them. So this was their first tournament where they were actually eligible to be part of qualification. Both of them, I mean, they're ultimately micro countries who, from a very selfish and purist perspective, are a little bit of a distraction in qualification. So although they're there, they never really got a realistic chance of getting any further. But I think, and logistically, in terms of incorporating them into the tournament, they are a little bit of an annoyance and a nuisance to some of the big teams because it's two extra games. There's lots of games which follow against these countries. Certain countries, Scotland, for example, seem to play the Faroe Islands almost every qualification cycle, and they are a bit of an annoyance, I think, and they just clog up the qualification process.
Although for this edition, Faroe Islands did create a surprise by defeating Austria in their very first match. Geopolitics took a center stage this time around, as in the summer fall of 1991 there was the civil war in Yugoslavia, and the break of the Soviet Union by the end of the year 1991. Can you explain the ramifications of these in the football world?
Yeah, so let's deal first with Yugoslavia, if that's okay. They were among the pre-tournament favourites, or certainly among the contenders. It's always slightly strange to talk about favourites in an eight-team tournament, but they were certainly considered potential winners. They'd impressed at the 1990 World Cup. They had a very, very strong side. Players like Dragan Stojkovic, Darko Panchev, Dejan Savicevic, who were, considered to be at the top of their game. In 1990 World Cup, they'd been very impressive before losing on penalties to Argentina. They were they're perennial dark horses, aren't they? Yugoslavia. That was the term that was always used about them as being contenders who might get there. I think along the way, the civil war led to initially there was a breakup and Croatia split away from the rest of Yugoslavia, and their players weren't able to play for some of the final qualification games. And then on the eve of the tournament, the UN applied sanctions on Yugoslavia, one of which is their exclusion from sporting tournaments. And so UEFA were effectively forced to act in that. Obviously, later on, that will have quite significant impact in terms of who actually is at the tournament. But that did feel like a big loss. It felt like the logical response from UEFA to, the only response they could make. But it did feel like a detraction, and it felt like a very chaotic preamble into this tournament. There's a lot of speculation as well. The Soviet Union, they'd broken up in 1991. You've got the fall of the Berlin Wall, a couple of years before that, and UEFA were left in a very tricky position in terms of the Soviet Union about who to actually let play in the tournament. So what they actually ended up doing was enabling this new, well, I say country, but it was a loose sort of arrangement between different countries who'd previously been in the Soviet Union, the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS. And they were allowed to take part as a sort of a natural successor to the Soviets. But there had been some talk about, do we let Russia play and represent Soviet Union on their own? Do you let another Soviet state take their place? There was also talk as well about allowing Italy back into the tournament in a similar way to what happened, we'll talk about with Denmark. So it felt like a very chaotic preamble in terms of, if you look at the Panini sticker album, just as an example, at the time, I think Italy are in there, Yugoslavia are in there. There was just a level of uncertainty about who was actually going to be participating in this tournament. So it did make it a very chaotic run up to the start of the competition.
You can't go 2 weeks on Twitter without seeing any posts saying that it was a given that Yugoslavia were going to win the 1992 Euros. But it just shows what a great side they
Mhm.
were at this point. Now, you kind of mentioned the Berlin Wall. Going back a few years before, there had been the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism in the fall of 1989. Now, obviously, that did have ramifications into the 1990 World Cup itself. But how had this affected the European football landscape? I imagine the fall of the Soviet Union is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say it was a very turbulent time, this, and that's not confined to football. Politically, it was a very, very turbulent time, and primarily the sort of knock-on impacts and the ramifications were felt outside of football. But Eastern European football had been really strong, for a very prolonged period of time. Go all the way back to the 50s, and you can see, the strength of Eastern European football. I think we then see the breakup of two of the real powerhouses of that period in terms of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and then the changes which took place in Germany as well. I think it's fair to say a lot of the effects hadn't quite filtered through at this point in time. So separating out, what we talked about in terms of Yugoslavia being eliminated and the CIS, I think a lot of those ramifications hadn't quite come through. But this was a period where Eastern European football was very strong. You talk about the 1991 Red Star Belgrade team, who were the European champions in the European Cup and had beaten Marseille in that. You go back a few more years, Steaua Bucharest had been finalists and winners of the European Cup as well. So there was a lot of power in those teams, and they were, typically heavily driven by the state. So I think we really start to see the effects come through in later years as this proliferation of different teams. You move to a period where the Soviet Union's contributing, I don't know how many teams they contribute to qualification now, 10 or so, ranging from, Russia to much, much smaller countries. And then Yugoslavia is similar in terms of now they're contributing, the former Yugoslav states make up, six or seven or so of the qualification UEFA. So you've suddenly got what was two countries are contributing about 17 teams. And I think that's where the European landscape now feels a lot more fragmented, whereas previously you could look to those countries as being real contenders.
The surprising absences this time included Italy and Spain, and to a lesser extent included the likes of Belgium, Republic of Ireland, Portugal, Czechoslovakia, and Denmark for a brief moment. It's inevitable, I imagine, with an eight-nation tournament.
Yeah, I mean they felt like big misses, but also we got used to big misses in the Euros. We've seen in previous tournaments. If you just rattle through the last few of them since they've moved to eight teams. England aren't there in 1984, France aren't there in 1988. There are almost always big teams who are missing out. Italy, I think, were a huge absence because I think you can make a pretty strong case that they had the deepest squad in world football at this point in time. Serie A is in its peak as the leading league, and the Italian players, really contribute to that. So those are a massive miss, I think. But as well, you could go on and on and on with the missing teams in Europe because Europe was the overlap between the teams who were succeeding for Europe in the World Cup and the teams who were qualifying for the European Championships was not really like a very perfect overlap. There were typically teams, whether it be Belgium, Romania, Republic of Ireland, who'd succeeded in 1990. There were other teams who'd succeeded in 1986 that you look at and go, wow, and they can't even make it to the European Championship. So I just think it underlined the sort of caliber of European football at that time as being exceptionally strong, and again, a real point to why eventually the expansion of the tournament feels inevitable.
Let's go through all the eight qualifying nations, starting with Group 1 that included the host Sweden. Following the 1990 World Cup, Ole Nordin had been sacked, and the new manager was Tommy Svensson.
Yeah, so I think Sweden, they've been a real disappointment at Italia 90. I think they'd gone into it as being one of the potential, again, it's a decent team who could probably make it out of their group. At the time, you had 16 teams out of 24 were making it out of their group at World Cup. So there was always a sense of optimism going into that, unless you were one of the real minnows. But in reality, they'd been very disappointing. They'd lost all three of their games. They'd lost 2-1 against Brazil, which is never a disgrace, but they'd lost also to Scotland and Costa Rica. So they were, one of the few teams who lost all their games at the tournament. But obviously they were the hosts, which is always a massive bonus in terms of chances in these sorts of tournaments. Svensson had done well, been a Swedish international earlier, done well as the manager of Tromsø, was highly rated, and Sweden had actually waited before appointing him a little bit of time to enable him to finish at Tromsø. Results since he'd been appointed have been quite a mixed bag, really. They'd had a series of wins and losses in their sort of warm-ups. Obviously, they weren't playing any qualifiers because they qualified automatically as hosts. So it was very difficult to get a good read about how strong they were. They had a couple of warm-up games against Poland and Hungary and had won those relatively comfortably and convincingly. So that was quite impressive. And in terms of personnel, they had a good few strong players. Arsenal fans be familiar with Anders Limpar, but they had a lot of players of real sort of technical quality. So Stefan Schwartz and Jonas Tern, who played with Benfica. And then, there were some promising attackers of different types as well. So they go on to do really well in the tournament. But beforehand, there was reason to think that Thomas Brolin, could be a promising player. Was already at Parma in Italy. Martin Darling was playing in Germany. They had the height of Kenneth Anderson, the experience of Johnny Ekstrom. So there were a few different components as to why they could potentially do well.
Yeah, and of course, in goal, you have Thomas Ravelli, you have Tommy Svensson's nephew, Joachim Björklund, who would join Rangers Glasgow a few years later, former Everton midfielder Stefan Rehn, among others. So this was the backbone, essentially, of the successful 1994 World Cup squad of Sweden. Now let's look at France. The 1984 Euro winners enjoyed a renaissance under the management of former star Michel Platini. Can you describe the progress of the team since the days of Platini the player?
Yes, I mean, France, until recently, or relatively recently, France have always been a bit of an up and down country. So they've gone through the sort of fallow periods and they've gone through the really successful periods. After Platini, they've gone back into one of their more fallow periods. So they'd failed to qualify for 1988, which we talked about last time, and they'd failed to qualify for the 1990 World Cup. And Platini had been appointed shortly after the 1988 Euros and had taken over partway through the campaign, but had failed to get them to Italia 90. But they'd been extremely impressive in qualification for Euro 1992. They'd won all 8 matches. They topped a difficult group, which included Spain and Czechoslovakia. They were on an exceptional, I think it was a 19-game unbeaten streak
Right.
when they then went and travelled to play England in spring of 1992 and lost. And when the draw had actually been made for this tournament, they had been the favourites. So they were considered to be, a very, very strong team. They had a lot of great players. Obviously, they had Jean-Pierre Papin, who was at this time the reigning Ballon d'Or winner, played for Marseille, and later in this summer would complete a world record transfer to Milan. They had some other great players from Marseille who'd been very successful, not necessarily great players, but very, very solid players, whether that be Basaboli, Deschamps, Jocelyn Anglomar. But they had quality in lots of different areas. Bruno Martini was considered to be one of the best goalkeepers in Europe at this point in time. They had obviously Eric Cantona, be familiar to English fans as another sort of wild card in there. So there were lots of quality players in there. And I think France were really perceived as being one of the teams to beat in this. Not necessarily the outstanding favourites, but one of a group of 3 or 4 countries who were touted as being the most likely winners of the tournament.
Yeah, and astonishingly, this would be the only major tournament that Eric Cantona played in for France. And of course, like you said, the France up front were led by the Papin Cantona duo. There was an Olympic Marseille backbone, as you mentioned, other players like Manuel Amoros, Frank Sauzet making up the Marseille contingent. You have a young Emmanuel Petit, who at this point is playing in defense. And you have the veteran Luis Fernandez, one of the stars of the 1984 Euros. We should mention Cantona had joined Leeds in mid-season after disciplinary issues that we all know about in French league. Going into the tournament, like you said, France were seen as favorites, but we would see that for various reasons it would unravel during these Euros. Naturally, everyone knows Denmark's story for these Euros. They had not qualified and were invited in the last minute to replace Yugoslavia, who were banned by UEFA. We've all heard the stories. The players were on vacation, they were on the beach, they had to be called back, etc., etc. But more importantly, something was rotten in the state of Denmark as Sepp Piontek's replacement as manager. Richard Moller Nielsen was not a popular choice, and their style of play was not the Danish dynamite of the old. I imagine not many would have looked at them as favorites at this point.
No, I think that's right. I think you're right in terms of stylistically they changed from the team of the 80s, but they'd also just changed in terms of personnel. Almost all of the players who'd been there for their success in 1984 and 1986, and even who'd been sort of carrying on in 1988 had almost all gone. So whether that be players like Preben Elke Larsen or Jan Molby, Berggren, or all of them had basically Søren Lerby, they'd all gone. Morten Olsen, and really there was very little left of the people who'd been the core of that team previously. Mentioned as well the sort of dynamics with the manager. They were missing Michael Laudrup of those players. One of the few players from that generation who could have played in this tournament, and arguably the best player in Europe in the 1991-92 season with Barcelona. Barcelona win the European Cup in the summer of 1992. He is one of the absolute mainstays of that team and one of the most creative players in world football. But because he's had that bust up with Richard Muller Nielsen, he's not available to be selected for the tournament. So in terms of personnel, they are not particularly strong. And as you say, they're not well fancied. They had actually performed pretty well in qualification. So, we talked before about Yugoslavia and how well touted they were. They'd actually gone and beaten Yugoslavia in Belgrade, albeit that came after the Croatian players had been forced to drop out from the Yugoslav side. But they were actually a pretty good team, Denmark, and their results demonstrated that. I think one of the big assets that they had was the fact that they'd managed to coax. They hadn't managed to get Michael Laudrup back into the international fold, but they had managed to get Brian Laudrup back in. And we'll talk about it later. He goes on to have a very, very important tournament. He's an exceptionally exciting player. I think fans of Rangers would remember just how exciting a player he was and one of the most exciting young players in Europe. Very different in terms of style to Michael. Michael was all about the passing, whereas Brian was an exceptional dribbler in terms of his pace and acceleration, and I think that really came through in this tournament. The one thing I would just touch on in terms of you mentioned it in terms of the on the beach piece with Denmark. I do think that's been. I'm not suggesting you were saying it as valid, but I do think that's been quite overblown
Right.
in
I mean,
terms of the way that
it
they.
keeps getting repeated when
Yeah,
when you
it
hear
gets
about
talked
stuff.
about. No, you're right. I
Yeah.
mean, it's still talked about all the time, and I think it's one of those ones which is just I appreciate it's a sort of mythology that's built up around it. But they were due to play the CIS already on the 3rd of June, so that the international players couldn't have been taking it that easy, albeit that was a prearranged scheduled friendly. But as well, the Danish club season wasn't due to finish, I think, until the 8th of June, and the majority of the players in the squad played domestically. So it's one of those ones of were they almost sometimes the mythology goes two ways. Either they were all on holiday somewhere in the Mediterranean, sunning themselves, or they were all tired from a domestic season which went on right up until the end of the start of the tournament. So if anything, you could say, they were sort of liberated, and obviously it turned out to be this way. They were sort of liberated from some of the pressure. But you're completely right. There were no expectations around them. They were very much making up the numbers at this point.
Another player who had a bust up with Muller Nilsson had been Jan Bartram, another former Rangers player. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think John Heinz may have also had issues with Muller Nilsson. And the team included some familiar faces: Peter Schmeichel in goal, John Sivbeck, who's playing at Monaco, former Manchester United defender. Others like John Jensen, who would join Arsenal after the tournament. Fleming Paulsen from Borussia Dortmund, former PSV, former Köln. Former Luton player Lars Elstrup, the controversial striker. Kim Vilfort, another familiar face for Denmark. The last team in the Group 1 were England, who were under great scrutiny as the new manager, Graham Taylor, who had replaced Bobby Robson after the 1990 World Cup. He had failed to build up on the success and the euphoria of the 1990 World Cup. I don't believe there was much excitement about England, who realistically should have been one of the favorites following their performance in the 1990 World Cup.
Yeah, so as you say, I mean, England had been a semi-finalist in the 1990 World Cup and been a penalty shootout away from beating West Germany, who become the eventual champions. Similar to Denmark in a way, they'd had a lot of turnover in players. So of three of their players, big players who departed from the international scene, had been Peter Shilton, Terry Butcher, Brian Robson, which is effectively the spine of the side. So, goalkeeper, centre back, central midfielder. And between those three, they'd got about 300 caps or so for England. So they were all gone. The qualification had been very workmanlike. I'd say Graham Taylor was a naturally cautious manager. Had success in the 80s with Watford initially, and then had done very, very well at Aston Villa in the 1989-1990 season, finishing second. And that had been really what had got him the job above some more sort of fancied names. People like Brian Clough, Terry Venables were always associated with the England job in this sort of time for the success that they'd had at Forest and Spurs. But Taylor got the job. In fairness to him, he was very unlucky with injuries, I would say. So this was a theme for him. But Paul Gascoigne had broken his leg in the 1991 FA Cup final and wasn't available to him. Although
In fact, he did not play all season.
that's right, he
Yeah.
transferred to Lazio in the summer of that. So it's all very complicated, but he's not available to Taylor. But in fairness to him, I'm sort of oscillating between these two things. Taylor was naturally quite suspicious of certain types of players and these sort of entertaining players. So he'd actually famously dropped Gascoigne for a qualifier and had brought in Gordon Cowans instead in his place. So it's not like Taylor could entirely say, well, I didn't have Gazza available to me, because he was already a little bit suspicious of players at that time. Another player who was injured, who he might well have played, was John Barnes, who was obviously a mainstay for England, had
Yeah,
got.
and he was injured in the last friendly before the tournament. Him and
Yeah,
Gary Stevens, both of them were
and
ruled
and this
out.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and the injury to Gary Stevens precipitated another crisis for England, which was the fact they had five right backs who were all injured for this tournament. So they were without players like Paul Parker, without Rob Jones. They basically didn't have any right backs left in the country, and that resulted in Keith Curle, I think, who was a just tall centre back who played for Manchester City, having a late call up. And so they were workmanlike in their approach to the game. There were other players who would have been available to Taylor, though, that he could have chosen, players like Chris Waddle, who was, exceptional at Marseille, is absolutely worshipped in Marseille for his ability and his talent, his skill that he brought to it, but was not chosen to be part of the squad. Peter Beardsley, another one who would go on to, and he was still playing really, really well, a few years later this. So it's not like they were past their ability to contribute. But Taylor was suspicious of those sort of maverick players or those creative players. He preferred a workmanlike approach. The squad was packed with really limited players, and looking back, it's a very average squad. There are people in there like Carlton Palmer, David Batty, Martin Keown, people who are very limited technically, tough, good work, but hard working players, but not anything that's really going to sort of set the tournament on a light. And the rare sparks of quality which are in the squad are players like David Platt, who had transferred to Bari and done very well in Serie A, and would go on later to play for Juventus and Sampdoria, and was one of, I always think, is quite an underrated player. David Platt did very, very well for England, scored a lot of goals and did well in Serie A. So I don't know that because of the style of player that he wasn't necessarily the most elegant, but he was very, very effective. And then obviously, the big standout player was Gary Lineker, who had been, top goal scorer in 1986 World Cup. He'd scored 4 goals in 1990 at the World Cup. So he'd got 10 goals already at this point in the World Cup and was seen as being, one of the few shining lights that the side really had.
And this will be Gary Lineker's last tournament. And in fact, after the Euros, he was set to join the new J League in Japan. So he was effectively looked upon to be in a pre-retirement mode at this point. Graham Taylor era was criticized for the number of experimentations, and even at some point during these warm-up matches, Mark Haitley, who had last played in 1988, even he was tried out in one of the matches. For the Euros, some of the familiar faces, you now have Chris Woods in goal. You still have Stuart Pearce of Nottingham Forest and Des Walker of Nottingham Forest. Others like the young Alan Shearer, who had gained his first cap early in the year, but at this point, he's still not looked upon as a starter for England. Now, let's look at Group 2 with Netherlands, Germany, Scotland, and Commonwealth of Independent States, the replacement for the Soviet Union. So let's start off with the defending champions, the Netherlands. They had struggled in the 1990 World Cup. They were still reliant on the AC Milan trio of Ruud Gullit, Marco van Basten, and Frank Rijkaard, but had a new star in Dennis Bergkamp of Ajax. Rinus Michels was back in charge of the team for his very last tournament. They had qualified from a group containing Portugal as their main rival. Had they recovered from 1990 at this point, do you think?
I think they had. So as you say, I think they'd gone into 1990 off the back of their 88 success as being one of the favourites, and they hadn't done well. They'd been quite disappointing in their group with they were in a group with Republic of Ireland and England, who they played in 1988, and then Egypt as well. And they'd really struggled. They didn't play very well throughout that tournament. Hullet was struggling with knee injuries, which would plague him throughout his career. They didn't really get going in that tournament under Leo Beenhakker. Now with Michels back, I think they were certainly considered to be right among the favourites, and they were a team. I remember as a child that I was particularly excited about the Netherlands, this Dutch team, because I thought they had a lot of exceptional players. As you say, they'd lost early in qualification to Portugal, but then bounced back and had qualified relatively comfortably in the end for the tournament. As you say, in terms of personnel, they've got Ronald Koeman, fresh from scoring the winning goal in the 1992 European Cup final against Sampdoria at Wembley. They've got Van Basten, who is probably at the peak of his powers at this point in terms of his form at club level. Hullet, I think, had put some of the injuries he'd had a little bit to one side and was coming back into some form. And then they had Frank Rijkaard, who I think we talked about him, last time out. I just thought he was an exceptional player, just such a great all-round player, whether he was in defence or in midfield. And he was consistently world class throughout this era. So in terms of those historic players, that sort of foursome of great players, those were all real reasons to be very optimistic. They've still got some of the players who had done very well in the last last tournament, whether that be players like Wouters or Van Breukelen. And then they've got this next generation of players coming through. We're sort of bridging the two generations here with the Dutch, because Bergkamp was right up there as among the most exciting players in young players in world football. He was constantly the subject of transfer speculation as to which of the different teams in Italy he might join, or was he going to go to Barcelona, or was he going to go to Juventus? And I think in the summer of 1993, he ends up going to Inter. But he was widely speculated as being one of the best, and just a player of sublime talent, technically outstanding, had a real life a goal. He was a real successor, and thought to be, and justifiably, turned out to be one of the great Dutch players. So that was really exciting. They had a few other younger players coming through. Players like Brian Roy, Aaron Winter, the Vitschke brothers, Wim Jonk. So you look through the team, and there was reason to think this might be a stronger team than even they had in 1988. So there was a lot of optimism, I would say, about them in terms of personnel. And if they could get right whatever had gone wrong in 1990, they would be one of the teams to beat.
You mentioned the Vitschke brothers. Yeah, Richard Vitschke, who was playing at Barcelona, he was actually injured before the tournament, but his brother Rob, he made the squad. And also to point out that following the 1990 World Cup, where you remember Frank Rijkaard, there had been the spitting controversy, etc. He actually retired briefly from the national team, but then made a return a year later. He would stay with the national team until 94. And also, Ajax had just won the UEFA Cup with Louis van Gaal. So you have the likes of Frank de Boer. You mentioned others like Wim Jonk, Aaron Winter, John van Skip. All those players were key players in this new Ajax. The Dutch, they were certainly better than 1990, but clearly they were not as good as 1988, where you had Hullet and Ronald Koeman, who were absolute best at that point. Let's look at the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, which is effectively the Soviet Union. Was there even any enthusiasm given the political happenings at home?
I think the political situation at home was extremely difficult for them. And I think the level of domestic enthusiasm for the team was at a very low point. I think, generally speaking, once you get to the tournament, footballers are often very good at screening out some of those issues in the background. So I think if the right occasion presents itself, footballers can be very, very good at putting to one side things which are happening externally. But I think you're right. There was very little enthusiasm domestically in terms of this tournament and this country. I mean, what was it? I mean, the CIS always sticks in my head just because of football. Because at this point in time, that felt like something brand new. What is this? I don't think probably outside of football, many people would have heard of the CIS or what it was, or the brief period that it had in terms of Soviet or Russian history. But I think that in terms of the team, they again had been, and I keep saying this about different teams, they've been a real big disappointment at Italia 90. So another team who, they've been finalists 4 years ago. They go into Italia 90 as being, again, not necessarily a favourite, but one of the dark horses, one of the teams who, I don't know what they were, probably in the sort of 10 to 15 to 1, something like that range of people who you think to yourself, these are credible semi-finalists, could well get that far and could end up winning it. And instead, they end up being a big, big disappointment. They were in a group, admittedly quite a tricky group looking back at it afterwards, but they were in a group with Romania, Cameroon and Argentina, and they finished last in that group, and they only really came to life in their final game, by which point they weren't able to qualify. So that had been a big, bitter disappointment. I think in terms of the players, we'd seen that incredible generation that they'd had in sort of 86 and 88, which are all based around the Dynamo Kiev players. A lot of those players have gone by that point in time. People like Desaev have gone. But there is a retained core of some of the strength that they'd had. Players like Alenikov, Kuznetsov, Mikhailichenko, those players who had been a core part of the success were still there. I don't think, they weren't the players that they had been previously. So I think there was less optimism around them. There were some new players to be integrated into the squad. So, talented players, Dobrovolsky, Andrei Kanchelskis, who, again, Manchester United fans will remember very fondly as a player with exceptional pace. Igor Shalamov, who was a player who was very, very successful in Serie A initially at Foggia and managed to get a massive transfer to Inter Milan off the back of it, and was a very elegant technical player. So I think they were awkward. Bishop's the manager, had been himself, a great player with the Soviet Union as an attacker. He had limited things to work with, but with all of these things, you get to a tournament. We see with Denmark, you get to a tournament and you don't quite know what could happen. So I think there probably was a level of not necessarily optimism, but just almost neutrality in terms of what they might do. But I don't think they would. They didn't go into it being perceived as being one of the favourites.
The 1990 World Cup champions, West Germany, who were now Germany, were now a unified nation under the management of the unpopular Bertie Vogts. And you had their main star and captain, Lothar Matthäus, injured just a couple of months before the tournament. Nevertheless, were they the pre-tournament favorites?
I think they were, as I say, that in terms of all these things, they're slightly dynamic in terms of the picture about who are the favourites at any given time, and it can change with events as they go in. I think Germany, France are the favourites, with the Dutch probably as well somewhere in the mix, and you can see why they were. After reunification, Franz Beckenbauer, the previous manager, had said that they would be invincible. And you can see why, because they had a great generation of players. Germany, West Germany had been exceptionally successful. You bolt on East Germany, who had themselves been obviously not nearly so successful, but had a good history of producing, quality players. And suddenly you should be able to do that. And potentially you're riding on the crest of a wave in terms of, optimism for the future for a unified Germany as well, without getting too sort of political or optimistic about it. But I think there was a lot of optimism around them. And in terms of the personnel, they are exceptional. The reason they'd won the World Cup, at least in part, was they genuinely had a great team. They had three great strikers, Rudi Völler, Karl-Heinz Riedler, and Jurgen Klinsmann, all of whom were top European players, regarded as among the best strikers in the world at that point in time. As you say, they'd lost Mateus, and that's a big absence. Mateus had been fantastic at the 1990 World Cup. He'd been the player of the tournament. He was the 1990 Ballon d'Or winner. He was at a point in time where we're moving on from some of the great players of the 80s. He's right up there among the most important players in world football, but he's not available to them, obviously. But fortunately for them, they're not short of replacements. They've already got players like Stefan Effenberg. They've got Thomas Hessler. They've got Andy Muller. They've got, a lot of players in there who have can replicate some of the qualities that Mateus brings to the table. They've got a couple of great defenders. They've got Jurgen Kohler, who is probably at this point in time, as good a marker as anybody in Europe, is seen as being one of the best stopper style defenders. So he's right up there. Bremer had been one of the outstanding figures of the 1990 World Cup as well, with his sort of quality of delivery and just all-round good play. And then you add in some of these Germans, players like Matthias Sammer, Thomas Doll, and suddenly you've got just an exceptionally strong squad. It was hard to find many weaknesses in there. You've got in goal, Bodo Illner and Kupka as being options. It's an extremely well-balanced squad. And I think in terms of European football, the only team at this point in time who can have a squad together who can rival that of Germany is Italy. And Italy aren't in the tournament. So straight away they start as being one of the teams you would have to fancy. Qualification had been slightly interesting. Beckenbauer said they were going to be invincible, and they end up losing to Wales during qualification, which isn't quite what you'd anticipate. If their first defeat had been to Brazil, say, you might understand it, but they end up losing to Wales. But had still qualified relatively comfortably. And yeah, they very much go into it as being, if not the team to beat, then one of the teams who really should be almost certain semi-finalists.
Backbone of the team was based in the Italian Serie A. You have the likes of Reuter, Kohler are playing at Juventus. You have Thomas Hessler and Rudi Völler at Roma, Karl-Heinz Riedler and Thomas Doll at Lazio, and Jürgen Klinsmann and Bremer at Inter. And of course, Lothar Matthäus was also Serie A player before getting injured and missing out. We have to say Stefan Effenberg was somewhat controversial at this point, and he had been booed by the fans of the national team at certain matches because he was looked upon as the bad boy, the controversial player at this point. And of course, We know what happens in 1994 World Cup with him. Overall, a well-balanced side. Who knows, had Mateus been around, maybe they could have won.
Yeah.
I believe ahead of this tournament, Rudi Feller and Andy Brehme had announced that they were going to retire after the Euros, or they announced after, I don't exactly remember. But in any case, they did retire after the Euros. But of course, then they would be convinced to come back for the 1994 World Cup. Now, the final team of the Euros were the surprise qualifiers, Scotland. I imagine, given their tournament history, not much was expected of them.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I think outside of Scotland, I mean, Scotland at this point in time is on a great run in international football. They'd been very, very successful in qualification for the World Cup. When they'd actually got to the World Cups, they'd never been successful. They never got out of the group stage, but they'd been very successful in qualifying, for a series of World Cups in a row, dating back to 1974. And they had a very good group of players. Another team who disappointed at the 1990 World Cup, Scotland have got a habit of doing this, where they play well against the big teams and then lose to the teams where they were expected to win. So they'd lost to Costa Rica in 1990, which had been a big shock at the time. But they'd qualified from a tight but modest group. They were in with Romania, Switzerland, and Bulgaria. And basically, they all finished on about 10, 11 points or so and could well have gone the other way. Had a couple of results gone against Scotland, then they wouldn't have qualified. But they had another really good group of players. So, I think Andy Gorham was a brilliant goalkeeper, probably the best goalkeeper. Certainly Scotland have had in the sort of last 50 years, maybe longer than that. They've been really, really very good for Rangers. Richard Gough was an outstanding central defender and captain. They had a lot of quality in midfield, players like Celtic's Paul McStay, called the Maestro, and one of my sort of favourite players. I've never had an affinity with Celtic, but as a child, he was a player that I really admired because he was so classy on the ball. McAllister was another one who had a lot of quality on the ball, and McCoist had been the top goal scorer that season in Europe for Rangers. So there were lots of different players around the pitch where you could look at and go, actually, there's quite a lot of strength here, and these could be awkward. Having said that, they're playing against the world champions, the European champions, and the finalists from the last Euros. So, one of the big things which is not counting in their favour is just the draw. The draw is makes it very tough for them. And so I think there's limited optimism. But Scotland, their fans, they always travel with optimism. And I think, this time there was an idea that maybe they could at least spoil a few people's parties.
Yes, and I remember in an interview, Franz Beckenbauer was asked about Scotland, and I'm paraphrasing him, but I think he said something like, I can't see a single player whose presence or absence would make a difference. So let's look at the Euros. Let's start with the first group with Sweden, France, England, and Denmark. The tournament kicked off on June 10th at Stockholm at Solna, with Sweden taking on France. Sweden would take the lead with Jan Eriksson scoring with a header, and France tied a match with a typical Jean-Pierre Papin volley. The match ended as a 1-1 tie. And on the following day, June 11th at Malmo, Denmark and England played to a dour scoreless tie. A few days later, on June 14th, again at Stockholm at Solna, Sweden defeated Denmark 1-0 through a Thomas Brolin goal. 2 days later, after this, on June 16th, Kim Vilfort had to return briefly to Denmark because of concerns over his daughter who had leukemia. And the situation with Kim Vilfort's daughter was also one of the stories of these Euros, how he had to deal with both situations at the same time. So at this point, Denmark's position, they look like they might be out, but that's before their third match. On the same day at Malmo, England and France play to another scoreless tie. This is a match where England, I think was it Stuart Pearce who hits a free kick to the crossbar? That's like the closest England
Yeah,
came.
That's right. And just moments before that, he'd been headbutted by Basil Bowley.
Oh, yes,
He's
yes.
defending a corner, and Basil
Yeah,
Bowley, completely unprompted, just goes up and headbutts him and flattens Stuart Pearce,
yeah.
who's probably one of the hardest people in English football history. You know, one of the only men who could ever play with it on with a broken leg. And he almost gets his revenge, as you say, from a free kick shortly after, which he crashes against the underside of the bar, but doesn't go in, unfortunately.
A strange thing at the end of this match, you see Jean-Pierre Papin raising his arms in triumph, and I think some French observers kind of took notice of that. That action did not sit well, seeing Papin celebrating basically a scoreless tie. Because I imagine he probably felt maybe Denmark were the easiest team in this group that they were to
Yeah, I
play.
mean, I think they'd got what they came for. Both of those teams in that game were negatively set up, and
Uh,
therefore it was almost what they both wanted at a point. Go into the last game and see how you went against Denmark and Sweden, respectively.
Well, in the end, it turned out bad for both. On June 17th at Stockholm at Solna, Sweden defeated England. England had actually taken the lead through David Platt in the fourth minute. Jan Eriksson scored his second goal in the 51st minute. And in the 82nd minute, you have that beautiful combination goal for Thomas Brolin's winner. Of course, this match is also remembered for the substitution of a very angry Gary Lineker playing in his final match for England. And England were eliminated. Same day at Malmo, you have Denmark defeating France. Henrik Larsson had given Denmark the lead in the 8th minute. Jean-Pierre Papin again tied the match for France. And in the 78th minute, Lars Elstrup scored Denmark's winner. And France were out, and England were out, who many pre-tournament, they probably would have been looked upon as the two teams who would have qualified, but in the end, they were both eliminated. Let's look at Group B. On June 12th at Gothenburg, you have the Dutch defeating Scotland 1-0 with a Dennis Bergkamp strike. On the same day at Norrköping, you have Germany facing off against CIS. CIS takes the lead through a penalty kick in the 63rd minute. Germany, they lose their captain Rudi Völler with a broken arm at halftime, and his tournament is over. And Jurgen Klinsmann would replace him for the rest of the tournament. It looked like the CIS were headed for a win until Thomas Hessler scored with a beautiful free kick at the death, and the match ended as a 1-1 tie. Fuller, yeah, he broke his arm in the 20th minute, but he remained on the field until halftime. On June 15th, the Dutch and the CIS faced off, and the match ended as a scoreless tie. Marco van Basten scored a goal with a header that was unjustly ruled out for offside. On the same day, Germany at Norrköping defeated Scotland 2-0. Karl-Heinz Riedle and Effenberg scored the winners, although one of them is sometimes referred to as an own goal because the cross was deflected. In this match, you have Reuter and Buchwald had gashes on their head and they had to be bandaged. So we come to the last matches in this group on June 18th at Göteborg. The Dutch defeated Germany 3-1. You have Frank Rijkaard scoring in the fourth minute, Rob Witzke in the 15th. Jurgen Klinsmann pulls a goal back in the 53rd minute, but Dennis Bergkamp scored the third in the 72nd minute. And in this match, Marco van Basten also has a very beautiful shot that hits the crossbar. So remember, he had scored that valid goal that was ruled out against the CIS. After this match, he said that he had scored 1.5 goals in this tournament. The Germans lost. Bertie Vogts said that at halftime, he was telling his team the only good news he heard was the result of the other match. And of course, in this other match at Norrköping on June 18th, you have Scotland defeating CIS 3-0. You have Paul McStay scoring in the 7th minute, Brian McClare scoring his first ever goal for Scotland after 26 cap in the 17th minute, and in the 84th minute, Gary McAllister scored from a penalty kicks. So the Dutch and the Germans qualified to the semifinals. Let's look at the semifinals. On June 24th at Stockholm at Solna, Sweden faced Germany. It would be the Germans that would win 3-2. Hessler scored again from a free kick in the 11th minute. Karl-Heinz Riedle scored a second in the 59th minute. Brolin pulled the goal back with a penalty kick in the 65th minute. Karl-Heinz Riedle scored again in the 89th minute, and a minute later, Kenneth Anderson scored a consolation goal. Sweden were eliminated, but with honors. They had given a positive impression, especially after their performances in the 1990 World Cup. A day later, on June 22nd at Göteborg, Denmark faced off against the Netherlands. It would end as 2-2. Henrik Larsson scored in the 5th minute for Denmark. Bergkamp tied the match in the 23rd minute. Larsson scored again in the 32nd minute. Frank Rijkaard tied the match with 5 minutes remaining. The game would go into overtime and penalty kick shootout. Most notably, Marco van Basten would miss his spot kick for the Dutch, and Denmark would win 5-4 on a penalty kick shootout to reach the final. That final was on June 26 at Göteborg between Denmark and Germany. And of course, we all know Denmark wins 2-0 with John Jensen scoring in the 18th minute and Kim Vilfort scoring in the 78th minute. And Denmark were the champions of these 1992 Euros. So, what are your impressions of the action overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall it's a little bit negative, I would say. So in the first group, really, England and France, the reaction you alluded to from Papin, that sort of sums up a little bit of their approach here. They're both quite cautious. In a way, they get what they deserve for being cautious because they could have been more expansive. We go back to sort of Taylor's original selection. Some of Michel Platini's team selections during the tournament conservative in terms of the way he lays his team out. He could be more attacking and more open. They get a little bit of what they deserve. At the same time, I think both of them are actually quite unlucky in terms of the balance of play. Both of them, I think, probably deserve to get more from the games than they actually get in certain ways. I think we talked about that Stuart Pearce shot against the crossbar. I think England could well have won against France. England could well have won in their opener against Denmark, and they have a good spell against Sweden as well. So they could have got more out of it. They don't. I think overall it's relatively drab. The second group is better. The second group has some, the Germany Netherlands game, all the history that goes on between those two nations. As you say, Germany get revenge in 1990 for the 1988 loss, which in turn is revenge for the 1974 game. And then here is another form of revenge for the Dutch. So we see that sort of pendulum swinging back and forth between them in terms of dominance. That's a better group with some better games. But yeah, I think the group stages are a little bit disappointing. The semi-finals they're more exciting. Two good semi-finals. The game with Denmark and the Netherlands is one of the great Euros games in my opinion. Really, really great game that has lots of drama. As you say, the Dutch get a goal late on to take it to extra time, and then we have a penalty shootout in which one of the best strikers in history misses a penalty to cost his team ultimately the place in the final. And then the final itself is another game which is a little bit disappointing, but there were quite a few reasons for that. But it's it's a great story for Denmark, but I think for the neutral, it's not as exciting as it could be.
Let's discuss the aftermath. In terms of spectacle, we remember 1980 had been dire, but 1984 and 1988 had been high quality. Unfortunately, this 1992 edition did not carry on from these two previous ones, and like you said, it was disappointing. Do you think that's been the general outlook on this tournament?
Yeah, I think so, and it's a shame because there are a lot of great strikers around. You've got we talked before about the Germany have got three top strikers. Papan,
And
great player.
sorry to interrupt you, but it's
Mm,
just also
mm,
indicative that the top goal scorer in these Euros had it was only 3 goals. Like you have 4 players sharing this title: Riedle, Henrik Larsson, Bergkamp, and Brolin with 3 goals, which is a paltry figure.
It is by the standards of a major tournament. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's three goals in 5 games isn't terrible, but it's not. It doesn't marry up with what we see in the past. Typically at Euros, we've had Platini with 9, we've had Van Basten with 5, and at the World Cup in this era, teams are typically we go a long spell where from Kempes onwards, it's 6. Kempes 6, Rossi 6, Lineker 6. It's 6 goals is what you need basically to be the top goal scorer in a World Cup. Admittedly, there is an extra game in that, but effectively, you should be looking at about 5 goals normally to be the top goal scorer, and nobody gets there. I don't think it's the fault of the strikers, though. I think it's the fault of the managers in terms of the service that's provided to them. I think, that's the problem here. The managers are generally cautious. There's a carry on from the caution at Italia 90, which we see, and which is a bit of a plague of that tournament. And that carries on here. Teams are set up not to lose. And it's difficult, isn't it? Let's be honest. You go into a tournament with 4 good teams in the group. If you lose your opening game, there's a very good chance you're out, or you're making it very, very hard for yourself. So some of that caution is understandable, but it does have unfortunate consequences in terms of the caliber of attacking play.
Michel Platini, who resigned after the tournament, during a press conference, he said that football is not like figure skating. They don't hand out points on style when he was criticized about his
Which is
tactics.
funny, and often you get that, don't you? It's funny how often the great attacking players, when they become managers, are often very cautious and wary of attacking skill. They're often the ones who almost,
Yeah.
whatever that reason might be, somebody like George Graham, for example, as a manager, was very cautious, and maybe it's because they understand the way that attacking players can unlock games, and therefore they're keen to shut them down. But it's a shame when you see that happen.
So, and another one of his quotes was that, like previous managers like Michel Hidalgo had so many technical players to call upon, while he said, I had Deschamps to call upon. And some people took it, I think that he may have been insulting Deschamps, but I guess he wasn't really. He was just pointing
Mm.
out that that was the type of players who were defensively strong players that he
Yeah,
had at his disposal. He didn't have players like himself or Alain Giresse to call
yeah,
upon.
yeah.
Also, Graham Taylor was obviously heavily criticized. England were disappointing. This was the end of CIS, and soon all those teams would be independent nations for the next cycle. Overall, it's not a very memorable tournament. We can even kind of say, if we're very objective, Denmark themselves were not particularly. I know it's a Cinderella story and all, but they were certainly not as attractive as the Danish Dynamite of the previous
No, not
decade.
not 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 at all. And I think one of the things which is a standout in the final, but also throughout the tournament. This is the last tournament where the back pass is allowed, and I think
Yes.
that's to me that is. People often talk about modern football, and there's often there's a classic thing of saying football didn't start in 1992 in reference to the Premier League and the
Right.
Champions League, but actually, in my opinion, modern football did start in 1992 when you eliminate the back pass, and it takes time for it to come through. And that's not to say that modern football is perfect or that it's better than football from the 1980s, because there've been stylistic changes. But if you watch the final, I don't know how many times Denmark pass the ball
Oh,
back to Peter
yes,
Schmeichel.
yes.
They
Yeah.
waste time constantly, and maybe that's one of the takeaways from this tournament is that's knocked on in the head. That's stopped, and suddenly, teams are forced to be a little bit more proactive. There's an extra element of chaos with goalkeepers who can't play with the ball, and to me, that's one of the reasons why this tournament isn't as fondly remembered. Is there's a lot of negativity, and that's typified through that use of the back
Yeah.
pass, which is a big change.
Speaking of Denmark, do you think that whole story and narrative of how they came on board at the last minute, that maybe the criticism of their style was kind of lost in a shuffle?
Yeah, I mean, I think nobody expected anything from them. They get a bit of a free pass, I think, in some ways from a stylistic perspective, because they're a small nation with no expectation. As you say, they've come in at the last moment, so the onus isn't on them to play football in a sort of attacking way. And obviously, as well, a huge amount of football is results. If you win and you play in a relatively conservative way, people don't typically care. They just look at the result. Whereas if you lose and don't play well, teams like England and France, it feels like you've neglected your responsibilities to attacking football, and it's also not paid off. So it almost feels like you've lost on both fronts. Whereas I think Denmark, they won, and they're a smaller nation, so there's greater acceptance or acknowledgement of the way that they might need to go about play, particularly given the limited group of players that they had.
Unlike 1984 with Platini and 1988 with Van Basten, no player really stood out as the undisputed star of the tournament. What was the takeaway as far as the standout players of this tournament? But obviously, none of them the actual central figure and star of the tournament.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why this tournament isn't seen so in such quite the same way, because a lot of the time when you remember tournaments, you can only take so much away. People typically remember the winners, they remember the great players, and this was a tournament where nobody really particularly stood out as an individual. I think there were some very, very good players. Bergkamp, Rijkaard for the Netherlands were both excellent. Brian Laudrup, we mentioned him at the start. Peter Schmeichel for Denmark, they were very, very good. Thomas Brolin for Sweden was excellent, and then I think Thomas Hassler as well was also excellent. He played really, really well. So I think there were individuals in there you can say these guys were very, very good. But as you say, there was no transcendent figure in the way that a Platini or a Van Basten were, and you can see that at the end of the year awards. Van Basten ends up winning the Ballon d'Or. He wins the World Soccer Award for Player of the Year. Despite not scoring here, it doesn't cost him because there is no single standout player. And this is a rare instance of that. You go back in terms of the Ballon
Right,
d'Or.
right. Logically, the
Mm,
star of these Euros should have been the
mm.
Ballon d'Or winner.
Yeah,
But
and you see
yeah,
that, you see that in almost every year, typically going forward, but
yeah.
but not this one.
Maybe Thomas Hessler or Brian Laudrup could have won the Ballon
Mm.
d'Or had they been a bigger star in these Euros. But Marco van Basten essentially won because of his exploits with AC Milan, and Hristo Stoichkov finished as runner-up for Barcelona, winning the Champions Cup. But as far as other players, Papin did well for France. Incidentally, Papin had said that France should have started every match 1-0 down, then they would have been okay.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like they only started to play when their backs were against the wall. We mentioned Jan Eriksson earlier, the Swedish defender. On the back of this tournament and his two goals, he joins Kaiserslautern in Germany. Like you mentioned, Brolin, Dahlin, and Kenneth Anderson were okay. Klinsmann did well after replacing Feller. Klinsmann had had a difficult season, and in fact, he had lost his starting spot to Karl-Heinz Riedle for Germany. But once Feller was injured, he was in the German squad and acquitted himself well for the rest of the tournament. But no breakout star. Let's look at the actual disappointments of this tournament and the reasons.
Yeah, so I think I've alluded to it a little bit, but England and France are probably the big disappointment. So England, they only managed to score one goal in three games, and they were devoid of imagination and any craft. And I think it is a shame because I do tend to think that Graham Taylor is a bit unfairly remembered as England manager. He was unlucky a little bit. He was unlucky in 1994 qualification in terms of injuries and some of the decisions, but he also didn't help himself. He was experimental. He oscillated between playing three at the back, four at the back. He had players in there like Carlton Palmer, used him as a sweeper in one of the games, and he didn't bring some of the good players that he could have brought with him. So, had he had a Chris Waddle or a Beardsley or somebody like that, they might have been able to change a game for him if he'd have been a little bit more positive. At the same time, the absence, the injuries to Gascoigne and Barnes, to all the right backs, those are some reasons to be a little bit more forgiving of him. But England didn't help themselves here. France, talked about it there. They were negative. They had had some very good personnel. I acknowledge what Platini says there in terms of you go down French history, whether it be Copa, whether it be Platini, whether it be Zidane. Typically, when France does well, there is that sort of archetypal number 10 who is a genius, effectively, who can change games. And they don't have anybody like that here. You could say maybe Cantona could have been given more responsibility in terms of making the play, but I think they are negative as well, and they get punished for that. I think the other one who were a bit of a disappointment here were CIS. So, they grind out a couple of draws to start in Group 2. Then they go in and collapse against Scotland and lose 3-0. So, you can be a little bit faulting of them because had they nicked a win there, they're suddenly into the latter stages. But I think given the political situation they found themselves in, the relative paucity they've got in terms of personnel, I think it's hard to be overly critical of their results, but they were very dull and negative in their approach as well. They were another team who what they wanted was a 0-0, and it's hard to empathise too much with anybody who comes not really looking to score a goal.
Van Basten was criticized, but I think he was just unlucky in some ways.
Van Basten played really well.
Yeah.
I completely agree. I think it's funny in some ways. Sometimes strikers don't play well and score goals and are considered to have played well, and other times they can play well and not get the goals they deserve. I thought Van Basten played really well. His all-round play, his link-up play, he's involved. He was the complete centre forward. And the tragedy here is that he's 27 at this tournament, I think, but we only get another year of Van Basten until he's
Yeah.
injured in the 1993 final, and that's the travesty is we don't get to see, he could well have gone on and played in 96 if he hadn't been injured. But as it is, we don't have any more of Van Basten. But I thought he played very well.
Hullet and Kuman
Mhm.
are certainly not
Mhm.
at the same level of
Mhm.
88, though they are
Mhm.
solid. Gary Lineker ended his England career not on a good note, just like the rest of the England team. We already talked about France. Yeah, as far as Germany, I think Bodo Illner, the German goalkeeper, he was heavily criticized. And after this tournament, actually, for like the next year, Bertie Vogts alternated between him and Andreas Kopke until the 1994 World Cup. His position was a little shaky at this point. What were the novelties of this tournament and how were they regarded at the time? They're getting ready for the 1994 World Cup. So now you have players with their numbers in the
Yeah,
front
that was
and
what
their
I was going to
names on the
say.
back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And it's
That's funny
clearly
because
with that
yeah,
in mind, I think. Yeah.
yeah. Well, it is, and personally, it's that sort of Americanization a little bit of sport, but equally something that I really liked. Actually, I remember at the time being very excited by the fact that players suddenly had their names on the back of the shirts, and it's something which gets adopted across Europe, quite quickly off the back of this. So I thought that was something that I really liked is that being a tournament with players with their names there on the back, and moving to more of that sort of squad number setting. There's an interesting one there as well that Scotland have a numbering system which follows how many caps the players have got, which
Oh
is
yeah,
something they've
McStay was
done
like number
previously.
three. Yeah,
Number
that's
three, which is always, and it looks strange when you look at it. So there's a little novelty for you as well. But yeah, I personally really like the shirt numbers and thought it was a sort of a nice little touch that we get to see going forward.
I'm trying to think, are any of the kits considered classics?
Not so much. I mean, I think the German kit is relatively considered to be like a good one, but not as good as 1990, which is obviously the one which is held up.
Right, right,
Similar to, I mean, again, the Danish one isn't as good as the one from the 80s. The Dutch
right.
one isn't considered to be like the night. But I personally like this. To me, this is a great. I love this era of it. The new sort of Adidas style of the block ones that France have got, for example. I personally I really like these ones.
In terms of quality and tactics, how would you compare this edition to 1988?
So I think the tactics, I think, were a big part of why it wasn't so good. I don't think that's a formational perspective. So I think we saw a blend of different teams playing different formations. There was a good use of 4-4-2, 3-5-2, 5-3-2 in terms of the different systems that different teams were playing with. And certain teams were moving back and forth between playing a flat back four and either playing three or five at the back, depending on their opponents. But I think what's a shame is that those system changes were generally negative in approach. So they were about how we could stop the opposition from scoring rather than about how we could score ourselves. And I think that's probably the big difference here is that teams they were more negative, they were more dour and conservative in their approach. And tactically, I think that was the key sort of takeaway here is how can I stop my opponent's best players from getting the ball in dangerous areas.
Of course, you already mentioned this would be the last tournament with the back pass ban would come into play. This is also the last tournament where the referees are wearing all black. And of course, starting 1994 World Cup, you have more colorful kits for referees. Also, this is the last tournament with two subs only. 1996 edition, that's the first one with the three substitutes. And of course, by then you would have the golden goal as well. At the end of this tournament, was it becoming self evident that more teams are needed and eight is a small number?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it was clear that Europe had enough good teams that it would need to expand. I think it's easy to say in hindsight because we don't know this is going to happen in 1992, but the breakup of the Eastern Bloc, as I said kind of earlier on, it leads to a proliferation of new countries who were coming in. But I think as well we can go back, whether it's rattled them off earlier, but whether it's Spain and Italy not playing here, France in 1998, England in 84, we see a lot of big countries who don't make it, but we also see a lot of the mid-sized, European nations who are excelling at the World Cup don't get to play here. So this tournament, for example, in terms of some of Europe's best players, or players who will go on to either excel at previous World Cups or future World Cups, there's no Hadji of Romania, no Schifo of Belgium, Michel of Spain's not there. There's no Roberto Baggio. There's no Hristo Stoichkov. Basically, a big cohort of Europe's best players aren't featured at this tournament, and so I think it does become it. And I think without getting ahead of ourselves, and I'm sure hopefully we'll come to talk a bit about this in the future, the 16 team era of the Euros is amazing. It produces
Yes.
some of the best tournaments in football
It's the
history.
best balance of teams, 16
Yeah,
teams. Yeah.
yeah, in many ways it is perfect. You could say it's a shame that they've moved past that now, but it certainly is a big improvement in terms of the overall picture.
In terms of television coverage, do you remember if there were any new developments or
I,
nothing?
I I don't think
Yeah.
there was anything particularly new. I think it just became it was bigger this tournament. I think it had grown in stature. But previously I talked, I think, in '84 about the fact that in England, for example, the Euros hadn't been shown consistently on TV. I think that had changed in 1988, but this one was a ramping up again of the importance of the Euros and becoming that little brother, if you like, to the World Cup. I look on the Euros now, and it grows across the '90s as being pretty much analogous to the World Cup, almost equal of the World Cup in terms of
Yeah.
of importance. So yeah, I think it's important.
In closing, how are these 1992 Euros regarded historically compared to previous and subsequent ones? Is this tournament, 1992 tournament, destined to be a somewhat forgotten one?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's always easy for us, football sort of historians or fans to overestimate the degree to which general football fans remember these tournaments. Typically most people can take away from most tournaments one or two stories. It will typically be the winners or an exceptional performance or a few different nuggets along the way. So I think it's easy to think that people remember more from tournaments than they do. This one I think is pretty forgotten. I think basically it's the surprise of Denmark winning it is the key story. I think there are some really nice stories along the way. You mentioned Kim Vilfort earlier and his daughter. That to me is one of the stories of the tournament, one that has always stuck with me as being very sort of poignant in terms of his divided loyalties as being a father versus his commitment to the national team and the fact that his daughter was, imploring him to go back to play for Denmark and represent his country. That to me has always stuck with me as being a really touching moment in there. But I think there aren't on the football pitch, there aren't that many great moments that stand out here. In terms of great games, I do think the Dutch played well in this tournament consistently. I think they were the best team overall. Their performance against Germany is the best performance. I also thought they were good against Scotland, and I think they would have been deserving winners. But I think this one is probably largely forgotten, and it's individual moments. It's that substitution of Gary Lineker. It's things like that stick out rather than being too many, more deeper stories of what's gone on here. And I think it ultimately it's seen as being a stepping stone towards that expansion of the European Championship and the tournament that it becomes. I don't think it's fondly remembered as being a great European Championship, but equally probably not quite as bad as 1980.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Robert, thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.